Well, welcome to Favourites podcast, and today I want to talk about a subject which I've touched on and keep coming back to on Faith Fruits in terms of written articles. I want to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. I talk often about mental health issues, and this is something that is very important as we think about church life. It's important for those of you that are involved in church leadership and in pastoral care to think about, but for all of us to be aware of as we participate in the church body. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the key words there, that it's traumatic and it's post-traumatic. So PTSD refers to when somebody has been through a particularly painful or traumatic experience. Now, assessing whether or not that is traumatic is not something that we do objectively from the outside, because it's how the person has experienced it. And something that I might be able to cope with, you might be able to cope with, might be incredibly traumatic to somebody else. But there's been trauma, there's been something that has disrupted them. And just like when you have physical trauma, a break in the arm or the leg, a blow to the head, just as that will cause immediate pain, immediate hurt, immediate health risks, but also there can be long-term fragility, long-term chronic consequences or flare-ups. So too when there's emotional trauma, dare I say spiritual trauma as well, what you will then see is longer-term consequences. And so post-traumatic stress disorder means that there is stress placed on the person that they experience going forward in life that may affect their emotional well-being, that will often come with physical responses that are subconscious, that they don't seem to be able to control, and will involve a certain level of reliving or re-experiencing the trauma and the sensations involved in the trauma in other contexts. Now, this is important for us when we're thinking about church life and pastoral care for two reasons. For three reasons. First of all, there will be people in the church who have personally suffered and so are going through PTSD. And by the way, in these individual contexts, I would encourage you strongly to get the person to seek medical help, to go to their GP and then allow the GP to start to ensure that they get the right treatment that they need. But pastorally, you'll be walking alongside people. And that leads to a second point. When we walk alongside people and their suffering, there can be a kind of a vicarious picking up of the trauma as well. So I would say that having pastorally counselled people, having been there with people, having shared some of their journey with them, I've been with asylum seekers, with people who have been through all sorts of anguish. We've had homeless people in the church who have been running away from abusive family contexts. And there are things that when they've been shared with you, somebody has told you their story, or they've shared with you court documents, asked you to read them for your advice. There are things that is very difficult to unsee and to unhear. And that is something that can have an ongoing effect. So one of the reasons why I'm very cautious about the use of the word burnout to describe what happens to Christian leaders, because sometimes we confuse this thing called burnout, where we mean somebody's been too busy and got too exhausted, with actually somebody just carrying so much pain and the pain of others that they are just overwhelmed by it. It crushes them. Perhaps at some point we will talk about how to handle that, how to manage that as brothers and sisters in the Lord, in terms of our own personal, spiritual and emotional self-care, if you like. But today I wanted to talk about another aspect of PTSD, corporate PTSD. I've got another article about this coming out on Thursday this week. I think that's when it should be published. But corporate PTSD is where a body, a group of people experience trauma and the consequences following from that. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is this, that we are interconnected and we care for each other. And so you can have a church where individuals will be affected, their mental health, their physical health will be affected by what has happened. And you get a group of people then that are experiencing the same types of symptoms because of the same cause. But the other reason is that we are a body, and so it helps us to think, at least metaphorically, about the church as a body, as one entity connected together, so that it will have its bodily responses. And there's an important thing there. PTSD is not just all in the mind. It is something that the body experiences. There's a book being written called The Body Keeps Score, meaning that a lot of the responses that a person has when suffering from PTSD are very physical and don't seem to be something that they are consciously aware of. The body itself, the nervous system, is teaching your muscles and your bones to react and to respond to danger with the kind of the fight or flight type responses. And so I'm finding it increasingly helpful to talk about the church as a body and how it together collectively, in terms of its culture, its church life, its public expression of being a body together, one body together, how a church can have this PTSD type thing. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. And we're going to talk first of all about causes of PTSD and think about that from a church perspective. So what types of trauma might your church be experiencing? By the way, what I would encourage you to do at this stage is I'm going to talk through some examples. I would encourage you to, when I've talked through them, to pause the recording if you are watching and listening with other people. And it may be helpful for you to do that, to watch this as a leadership team or even as a whole church membership together, or as a small group together, and then talk through some of these things. See if you can identify where and when your church has experienced them. The other thing I would say before we dive into the list is you might need to go back in history a bit. So because you don't have like one generation of church members who serve in the church and then they die or move on, and then a completely different group of people come in. No, there's constant coming and going. There's constant overlap of people. What that means is that the trauma, the distress, the problem, the root cause of issues within your church life and church culture and church experience now may go back beyond the living memories of current church members. That there may be things that happened in your church 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, even longer. And you're carrying the consequences, and your church body is experiencing the post-traumatic stress disorder now. So be ready to go back in history on these things. So what do we have? Well, first of all, disunity and splits. When there's division in the church, when there's civil war, when there's discontent and grumbling and complaining. Now, there are different types of split. You can have a clean split, if you like, or a clean break, where there's disagreement in the church that might be about doctrine or worship, maybe about a major issue or a minor issue. But some of the church leave and start a new church elsewhere. Hopefully they go a distance. I know of one church that split, and a new church was formed, and they bought some land and put up a building within literal spitting distance of the church they'd left. Probably not a good idea to do that, because what that means is that the wounds are left open for a long time. Probably a good idea. Sometimes these splits are unavoidable. Sometimes it's necessary to leave, but probably a good idea to put a bit of space in between, both for you and for those you're leaving. But you have the clean break. The other way that you get splits, it's more splintering, and what will happen is that different people will leave, and rather than forming their own new church or going to the same church together, they leave over a period of time at different points under different pretexts, and they go to different churches elsewhere. That's actually harder to deal with in some respects, I think, because you've got this constant. The church is constantly being hit by trauma as it loses more people, and as the issues seem to be spread wider, so that more Christians and more churches are aware and involved in what's happening. But the other type of disunity and split is actually within the church. It's contained and constrained within it. And that can be particularly toxic, that you have these long running battles, this sense of discontent and unhappiness. Often you don't know where it really is coming from. Just the constant murmuring, the constant complaining. And often in those kinds of contexts, when you try to engage, say, what's the real issue? Nobody can really explain what it is. And when they raise particular issues, you discover that those issues don't, on the face of it, seem to be there at all. That the things that people are saying are issues, when you check, they're not. That the particular thing that they believe the church isn't doing, it turns out the church is doing. The particular things that they think are being said from the pulpit are not being said from the pulpit. But there's this atmosphere that grows, and again, it's this sort of repeat, like a drip or a constant punching, and it's there, and the wounds never heal, and it creates this sense of trauma. Secondly, false accusation. When one person in the church is singled out and accused of something and it's not true, then the church body will feel that together. First of all, it will bring a sense of shame. Accusation, whether true or false, tends to bring with it feelings of shame, embarrassment, and hurt. But there will also be anger, righteous anger at false accusation, shared by the church family together, but with the risk that if that isn't dealt with, that it starts to take root in people's hearts and in the collective heart of the church, leading to bitterness. Then there will be the trauma of bereavement and loss that you might want to think about. And when I talk about bereavement, I mean, and loss, I mean two types here. First of all, literal bereavement, where there's physical death, particularly of where there's either a sudden and shocking death, perhaps the death of a child or a young person, or the death of somebody who was greatly loved, known within the church, perhaps a leader, or somebody that was really the core of church life. Loss. Bereavement and loss also applies not when there's been a physical death, but when you have been bereaved of somebody or something. So, of something. It could be that the church had plans, a vision, a dream. Perhaps your church was about to get its own building, and suddenly at the last minute that wasn't possible. Perhaps there's a particular mission that you've been involved in and that comes to an end. But also the loss of people. If your church has been through those splits, and particularly the splintering, then bereavement, grief, because there are people who have left. And there may even be questions about the justice and the fairness of it. And perhaps there will be sympathy within the church for those who have gone, or perhaps there's resentment and anger against them. I think this is a particular challenge with churches when a pastor leaves or retires, especially if that's after a long term ministry. I think there are huge benefits to having pastors who commit for life. There's guys that do 25, 30, 35, 40 years at the same church. But what that also means is that for many of the church, maybe all of the church, the only pastor, the only leadership, the only pastoral care, the only preaching and teaching that they've really known has been that of the one pastor. And so when that person steps down, even if they finish well, even if they finish naturally through retirement, even if the handover is good and positive, there is still that sense of loss. And you still need to consider how you are going to allow for bereavement and grieving. And it may be that you, as a church, didn't have the opportunity to do that. Maybe because the ending wasn't good. Maybe because of the circumstances. A lot of churches will have seen pastors retire or move on in the middle of the pandemic, right at the point of lockdown. And they weren't really able to say goodbye. They weren't really able to process it together. Persecution and suffering, I guess that will play into the false accusation side of things. But it could be that your church is being persecuted. You may be joining and listening in from a country where persecution is very much part of things, or it could be that you are in a country where you wouldn't expect there to be persecution, but there are people who are enemies of the church, enemies of the gospel, and they are making trouble for you. Well, it's traumatic. I remember visiting a country, an Islamic country, and spending time, and the church had a hospital building. And so the church building and the hospital building and guest accommodation were within a complex. Right next door to where that complex was, a mosque had been built, and all of the loudspeakers were put directly onto the church and onto the complex. I know because I was awakened from my seat by the blast, by the noise at 5 a.m. of the call to prayer. It was intended to intimidate. It was intended to cause trauma and disruption. And incidentally, we are seeing that here. I know of 2 churches where mosques have been built right next door to their buildings. One I've known for many years, another where we were just driving past on the flyover the other day and looked down and saw for the first time, wow, there's the mosque built to dwarf, to overpower the church building. There are other ways where people can persecute through harassment and bullying. But suffering can come without persecution, just through circumstances. I think the church suffered during COVID. I don't think that lockdown measures were authoritarian persecution of the church designed to silence the gospel. But I do know that we suffered as our life together was severely disrupted. A church will have suffered abuse, suffered trauma if there's been abuse. Think of those recent scandals where there's been spiritual, emotional, and sexual abuse from church leaders. A church will be traumatized by that. A major sin, because it's shocking and horrific, where there's the necessity for church discipline, that will also bring trauma. So let me remind you of those again and encourage you, if you are with others, to pause and to reflect. Have we seen examples of these? Maybe one of these more, or maybe more than one of them in our church? And have the effects, well, first of all, what have been the effects? And has anything been done to resolve the consequence of those effects? Disunity and splits, false accusation, bereavement and loss, persecution, suffering, abuse, major sin, and discipline. Now, all of that's important because what then happens? Well, we know that when a person experiences trauma by perhaps being in a distressing physical accident, or witnessing something distressing, or experiencing abuse, or being involved in conflict. A lot of PTSD arises out of conflict and men and women that have served on the front line in the forces. Well, that PTSD means that how a person lives and responds, how they react to things, is affected. So I want to show you, if you're watching, in another diagram, and I will talk through for those listening. This is a diagram that compares PTSD from a single trauma with complex PTSD when there's been multiple or repeated traumas, and there's a good chance that your church has experienced repeated trauma, so that there's complex PTSD. That is so because your church has had plenty of time for different distressing things to happen, because of spiritual warfare, but also because your church will include members that will be coming in bringing their own traumas, their own individual, their own family, their own previous church trauma with them. And what you see is that when we talk about that complex PTSD, there are a number of ways that people are affected. Notice the biggies, the big trauma consequences. First of all, there's the problem of reliving trauma. Reliving trauma. The sights, smells, sounds, words, events bring back either with flashbacks or feelings, memories. Sometimes it's so subconscious that it's not in the memories, even that it's in the conscious memory. It's just subconscious and in the body. Are relived. There can be avoidance. As a person is just too afraid to face circumstances and situations. And the third biggie there is described as arousal, this just heightened state of being tense and on your guard. Remember that our response to dangerous situations is this alertness, and the adrenaline kicks in, and we're poised, ready for fight or flight. And in PTSD, a person's continual state of mind and physical alertness is that constant readiness that the adrenaline is pumping. And that's where you get these sort of high levels of anxiety. But you will also note that, particularly start to get into the more complex, long-term aspects of it, that a person can experience problems with intimacy, the ability to form healthy, close relationships with others. That's part of the avoidance and the arousal, the alertness, that others are seen as a threat or as harmful to be avoided. Or because subconsciously, just the face, just the sound of a voice, your mind and your body links it up with someone or something in the past, even though this person has nothing to do with that, and you start to relive. Complex PTSD will come with feelings of guilt. I'm to blame, it was my fault. Survivor's guilt. I shouldn't still be here. Anger at what has been done to you and done to others. With that guilt and shame and anger will come a feeling of worthlessness. And the person may struggle then to manage their emotional responses to things. So there will be the depression, the anxiety, the anger, those kinds of things. Now, it may be that you recognize some of that, not all of that, in yourself. I encourage you, if it is you, that you may want to pause, you may want to find help. I would encourage you that if you are personally suffering from PTSD, to immediately and initially talk to your doctor, to your GP, to get some signposting for help. But you may be also listening to those descriptions, those labels, and thinking, I can see how that works out in the church, some perhaps more obviously than others. So the next thing I want us to do is a little bit of diagnosis in terms of what our church as a church body may be experiencing. So I'm going to give you some questions, and I would encourage you to talk them through together with church leaders. Indeed, if you are watching at the moment as a group of leaders, why not take the time again to pause the audio or the video and talk them through. So here's some diagnostics to do. Here's the first question. What words would you associate with the overall culture of the church? So think about your church and just brainstorm, just say the words, single words. Start with single words that describe the atmosphere. There may be some wonderfully positive words to say them. Loving, joyful, kind, caring, persevering, persistent, dedicated, faithful, evangelistic, sound, emotional, charismatic, happy. But you may also pick up on some other words. Fear, guilt, shame, anxious, insular, isolated, crushed, painful. Start with single words. You might then want to build up into phrases. You might want to take some of those words and flesh them out and describe a bit more about what you mean by them. But by using the single words to start with, that just allows you just to give quick, gut, immediate heart responses. Here's the second question. How would you rate or describe the church in terms of healthy intimacy with God? So you think about your own individual relationship to God, but think also about the church collectively. How does it view God? How does it talk about God? How does it talk to God? Would you say that this is a church that is able to talk about God as Father, Jesus as brother, as friend, as Saviour, as healer? Are those concepts strong in the church vocabulary? And by the way, healthy intimacy will also mean that we are able to talk about God as King, as Lord, as Judge, about his authority, his power, his sovereignty, as well as his love. Because if we are avoiding those terms, those concepts, then that also points to a lack of real intimacy. Think about the songs that you sing. What words are used? Think even about whether there's a particular mood that dominates the music. Is it all lament? Is it all sort of happy and joyful? Do your songs primarily declare doctrine? It's good to have songs that do that. But is that all that they do? Think about the preaching. I think not just about the content of what is said, but think about the tone as well. Do you feel cut to the heart and convicted by the preaching? Does the preaching comfort and encourage as well? Or do you feel like you're being suffocated by a ball of fluff or hit on the head with a blunt instrument? Do your preachers convey the impression that they know and love God? How would you describe intimacy in terms of relationships within the church family? Is there closeness? Is there care? Are you loving? Is there unity? Or is there distrust, a wariness, a distance? Is there disunity? And then think about your relationship as a church to others outside of the church, to the community around, to other churches, to other networks, to your own network, to other organizations. Do you have healthy external relationships? Or are you isolated? Here's the fifth one. How often are you as a church reliving past experiences? Is there a tendency to see events and decisions now through the prism of what happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Again, why not take time just to think through those questions? And if you are, as you pick up the answers to those questions, if you're getting evidence in those answers of problems with intimacy, relationship with God, relationship with each other, problems with avoidance or arousal, alertedness, as there's an anxiety, even a hostility, a fear of others. There's evidence of shame, guilt. If there are examples of reliving the past, then that might point to a church that is suffering from PTSD. So, what should we do in response? And here's the last bit I want us to think through today. There's a treatment to use the medical model here. Well, the first thing I want to say is this. It may be that if your church is particularly struggling in these areas, if this describes your church, that what you actually need is revitalization. That's a big word. What do I mean by it, and why am I using it here? Well, anybody who's regularly follows Faith Roots, listens into podcasts, reads articles will know that I'm passionate about seeing churches multiply, to see churches planted, to see gospel communities in neighbourhoods and towns and inner cities and suburbs where there isn't at the moment a meaningful or effective gospel witness. And sometimes that means that there's no witness at all, that there's never been a church or churches that have closed, and there's a need to plant a church. But sometimes there is an existing church, an existing evangelical or gospel church, not a liberal one or a Catholic one, a church where the gospel is believed and preached, but its witness is ineffective. That the church is unable to get out with the gospel, so that people are not hearing about Jesus, people are not being invited in, people are not joining, or if they join, if they do come along, what they experience is very unhelpful. In such cases, I want to talk about that as revitalization. The need is for the church to be refreshed, revitalized, renewed, reformed, so that it is able to be effective and lively and alive again. Revitalization can happen at any size or stage of church, so we often use it to describe churches that have got very close to closure with just a small handful of people left. But we probably would do better to describe such situations as needing a replant, a fresh start. Revitalization probably suggests that there is more of an existing church to preserve and to renew. And so your church could have 50 members, 100 members, 200 members, but because of what has happened, failures in the church or experiences that the church has happened may have become ineffective and needing revitalization. And I mention that because how you approach revitalization, particularly if you're in the process of looking to call a new pastor, is different to how you might normally approach calling a pastor. That you might need somebody different to what you would expect. That there are particular gifts, skill sets, experiences, demeanours and characters that make some people better suited for that type of work than others. So if you're about to advertise, recruit, appoint, then stop and ask, are we in a revitalization type situation? And have the overt conversation about it. And if you are looking at going to pastor a church, then it's worth stopping and checking, is this a church that actually needs revitalization, and do I have the particular gifts for it? Going through these diagnostic questions and discussing some of these things with the church may be a helpful way of finding out. So one part of treatment is revitalization. The other thing about revitalization is that as well as potentially bringing in a new pastor, you may also want to bring in other Christians to come and join the core team, if you like. There are reasons for that. It's highly likely that those involved in core ministry leadership and those involved in leadership and elders have been quite badly hurt and damaged by the trauma and the PTSD. and may struggle to continue on at the moment. There may be a time when they can come back into leadership even in the same church, but they may need to step back and take a break. And you may find that if you've been through this trauma, that you are not in a position where you can immediately bring other people into leadership that are ready to lead. And so it may be that, as well as recruiting a new pastor, that you want to proactively look for others to come and join you. I would encourage a church in this situation to get outside help and counselling. It might be something that you can talk to a network like New Frontiers, Catalyst, or the FIEC to ask if there are particular people that can come in as a team and spend some time, even over a few weeks, even over a few months, to be available to talk with people individually and together in groups, to give people space to come to terms with what has happened and to talk about it. And there's the third thing. Give space for healing. That's what your church needs at the moment. And that means thinking about how and where we give that space. Have a look at your normal weekly gatherings, your home groups, your Sunday services. Are you giving space for healing? A couple of suggestions. One, look at your home groups, your community groups. Is this a season? Is this a time when you want to be doing heavy Bible study? Or even really focused prayer time? By the way, I would say that there is a time for focused and corporate, passionate prayer and fasting, and that is something that you will want to build into your space for healing. But you may just need space for people to be together, to learn to be together, and to relate and build those relationships up again. Is there space for that? What about switching from a Bible study to a weekly get-together for food, some conversation and a bit of prayer? Look at Sundays. Do you give space in your church services? Is it primarily a time when information is given? Or are people allowed to respond? Look at the songs you sing again. Look at the content of your preaching. What should you be teaching and preaching about in that context? You might want to give additional time and space for this. Taking away the whole church for a weekend, a church holiday, a church weekend away, bringing in some of that outside help, the counselling, the teaching, the advice to support you through the weekend. And it may be helpful to do something similar with leaders and their wives and their families as well, to support them. I hope you found this helpful and useful. It may be that there are questions that you've got. It may be that you would like some outside support and help, even just to talk through some things with someone. I just wanted to say that I would be very happy to give time to talk with you, to talk with others amongst your leadership if that would be beneficial. We can do a Zoom call or potentially in-person calls if that would be helpful. Just get in touch with me and be happy to set something up. Ultimately, we believe that healing and life is from the Lord. When we are physically or mentally ill individually, we believe that medication is helpful and good, that treatment is good. Because God works through those ordinary practical means. We also know that sometimes God heals supernaturally without medical intervention through prayer. But we also know that sometimes we have to live with wounds, this chronic pain for a long time. And all of those things may kind of apply to the church as well, that there are practical steps that we can take. That sometimes we have to learn to live with our wounds and walk with a limp as a church. But in fact, the rehabilitation takes into account those things, that we don't come out completely unchanged. But ultimately, we trust God and His sovereignty. And as I said, there is that important place of prayer, and that's the big need for your church family when you have been through things like this. To get people praying again, to seek the Lord and to learn to trust Him and to see what He has been doing, even through your trauma, even through your pain, even through your failure, how God has been working for His glory and for your good as a church family together and individually.